Hello friends, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Rohaina Khan from SNDT University, and today I will be talking to you about how the brain works in learning. When we look at the brain, when we look at what the learning outcomes for today's topic will be, we are going to define the different parts of the brain. We're going to explain the working of the neuron. We're going to look at what is learning and the factors that affect learning. And we're going to look at all of these things with regard to how the brain learns. The human brain is the most complex organ in the human body. We have known for a while now that the brain is the command center of our bodies, and it is the area responsible for learning. New developments in neuroscience are constantly giving us better insights into how our brain works. In order to understand how we learn, we must first understand some basic anatomy and physiology of the brain. Now, when we talk about understanding the brain can be functionally divided into three different parts. You have the brain stem, the cerebrum, and the cerebellum. The brain stem connects the brain to the spinal cord and relays information between the brain and other parts of our body. It is also the control center of our heart rate, breathing, and temperature. When we look at the cerebellum is responsible for motor functions like balance, posture, coordination of complex muscle activities. The cerebrum is the largest region of the human brain. It is where higher order functions like memory and reasoning takes place, and it is the most important in learning. We look at the cerebrum a little more in detail. The cerebrum is divided into 4 different lobes that are named after the skull bones that cover them. They are the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. The cerebrum can be further divided down the middle lengthwise into 2 halves called the cerebral hemispheres, the left cerebral hemisphere and the right cerebral hemisphere. The hemispheres are largely symmetrical, and the left hemisphere controls the muscles on the right hand side of our body, and the right hemisphere controls the muscles on the left hand side of our body. One hemisphere may be slightly more dominant depending on whether the person is left or right-handed. Each of the 4 lobes specialize in various functions: sight, hearing, speech, touch, short-term memory, long-term memory, language, and reasoning abilities are the ones that are most important for learning. We look into the lobes in further detail now. We'll start with the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is the emotional control center of the brain. It is responsible for our personality, for influencing our decisions, and for regulating social behavior. The frontal lobe controls cognition, problem solving, reasoning, planning, and impulse control. The parietal lobe. The parietal lobe processes sensory information from various parts of the body and coordinates spatial relations. It is responsible for sensation, perception, and spatial reasoning. We go on to the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe houses the primary auditory cortex, which is important for interpreting sounds and language. The hippocampus, which is actually the Latin word for seahorse, and the hippocampus is named because it is shaped like a seahorse, is located in the temporal lobe. The hippocampus plays a very important role in learning. The hippocampus is involved in processing new information and transferring information from the short-term memory to the long-term memory. The temporal lobe is also implicated in the interpretation of sounds and smells. We go on to the occipital lobe now. The occipital lobe is in the posterior of the brain and is the primary visual processing center of the brain. It is responsible for visuospatial functioning, movements and color recognition. In the human brain, information must be stored first in order for learning to take place. So, the areas in the brain that are most important to learning are those involved in memory. Other critical areas, including regions involved in processing information from the 5 senses and information about the body. They serve as the inputs to the memory system. Now we look at neurons and how neurons work. While the brain can be divided into many divisions physically and functionally, the neuron is the basic working unit of the brain. A neuron is a specialized cell within the nervous system that is designed to transmit information to other nerve cells, muscles or gland cells. Neurons communicate with each other via chemical and electrical messages. There are around 100 billion neurons in the human brain, and they make up a complex system of neural pathways that form the basis of learning. Neurons have a cell body, an axon and dendrites. The cell body is the main part of the neuron. The axon is like a long cable-like projection that carries the electrochemical message along the length of the cell. The dendrite is actually a Greek word for tree. So the dendrite or nerve endings are branch-like projections which connect with other cells and allow the neuron to send messages to other cells. Information from one neuron flows to another neuron through a synapse. Neurons are covered by the myelin sheath, which is like a protective layer, like an insulated electric wire. Now we look at how exactly does learning take place. Now, what happens when we encounter something new? Sensory information is transmitted along these neural pathways and stored in the short-term memory. The short-term memory is like a temporary storage area for all the flood of sensory information that we receive and encounter in our daily lives. The sensory inputs are processed in short-term memory, and the neural pathways carry these to the structural core of the brain, where they are compared. They are compared with existing memories, and then only are they stored in our long-term memory. Our long-term memory is like a vast storage area of everything we have learned and experienced in our lives. This process, though it sounds long, actually occurs in an instant, and it is not always perfect. So, when two neurons frequently interact, they form like a bond that allows them to transmit impulses more easily and accurately. This leads to more complete learning and much easier recall of information. When two neurons have rarely interacted, the transmission is often incomplete, leading to a faulty memory or no memory at all. This is how we acquire new information, store it in our memory, and retrieve it when needed. The strengthening and weakening of connections among brain cells is what leads to learning and memory. If you take the example of learning a new route to a new place as opposed to your daily commute. Now, when you are going to the new place, you have to take an effort to get directions, You look out for landmarks, pay extra attention to the road signs along the way. The neurons involved in taking us to the new place have not shared connections before, so they don't communicate as effectively. If we take the same route for a week, the connections between neurons in the brain are strengthened, and now we would have learned the new route. Now we look at some of the factors that influence learning. When learning new things, memory and recall are strengthened by frequency and recency. The more we practice and rehearse something new, the easier it is for our brain to transmit these experiences effectively and store them for ready access later. The same thing happens with the more recently you have learned something. If you have learned something a while ago, as opposed to if you have learned something more recently, you will be able to recall what you have learned recently much better than you have learned something a while ago. Now we look at new learning. The brain behaves selectively about how it processes experiences that enter through our 5 senses. The brain is programmed to pay special attention to any experiences that are new or unusual. It does this by making comparisons between the new information brought through the senses and existing information stored in our brain's long-term memory. When the brain finds a match, it will quickly eliminate the new memory as redundant. When new information contradicts what's already stored in memory, however, our brain works hard to explain the discrepancy. If the new information proves useful to us, it becomes a permanent memory that can be retrieved later. If this new information does not seem useful, or if we do not trust its source, we are likely to forget it or even reject it altogether, preferring to stick with the information that we already know. Now we look at past experiences. Past memories can sometimes be an impediment to future learning that contradicts previous information. As we age and gain more experience, we tend to rely too much on our past knowledge. We may miss or even reject novel information that does not agree with previous memories that we have. Multiple sensory inputs. The structural core of the brain receives sensory information from different regions and then assembles bits of data into a complete picture that becomes a memory of an event. This memory is strengthened by multiple sensory inputs. For example, if we both see and hear something, we are more likely to remember it than if we only hear it. If we experience an emotional reaction to something like fear, anger, laughter, or love, that emotion becomes part of the memory and strengthens it dramatically. In recalling memory, if we have experienced an emotional reaction, we are far more likely to remember the event and with higher accuracy than if we simply witnessed an event without any emotional attachment. That explains why highly emotional events like birth, marriage, divorce, and death become unforgettable. When we summarize, the human brain is the area where learning takes place. It can be divided into various parts that have many different functions. The cerebrum is the most important area for reasoning and memory, and it is the area where learning takes place. Neurons are the basic units of our nervous system and form the complex neural pathways through which we learn. It is the strengthening and weakening of connections among brain cells is what essentially leads to learning. Several factors impact how we learn, how frequently we are exposed to the information or how recent the information is, inputs from multiple senses all help us remember better. We pay more attention to new information. Past information is relied upon more than new information. Thank you.